We're the continuing series that we have with Bishop Michael Nazir-Ali on mission and the Anglican Church. Just to note, last week I said that this was the last sermon. It's not. This is the penultimate. These two sermons are the lectures are the penultimate lectures, but there will be two more given in May. So we've started, but this will complete as a series as of May. And with that, I turn it over to you, Michael, and I will share screen and put up the PowerPoint.
Well, thank you, Tom. Just to remind people about what we've been doing, we were talking about the history of Anglican mission, really, but through that lens to look at Christian mission generally, and also to look at other traditions where that was relevant. So we began with mission in the past, both the arrival of Augustine from Rome and also the Celtic mission from the north, and then the subsequent histories that followed. We looked at contemporary situations and also about what the future might bring. We considered the emphasis in Anglican mission history on incarnational presence, but also about what I call peregrination, that is to say, mobility and the desire for people to go from one place to another. And then we've been looking more recently at inculturation and dialogue. What are the limits to inculturation? What is the scope of it? And what are the criteria for it? So today we come from inculturation to prophetic ministry, social responsibility, and action as aspects of Christian mission. So I want to begin by saying that the Bible's anthropology is social from the very beginning. Human beings are created male and female together. They are created in God's image for one another, and they're given two joint tasks, the procreation and nurture of children, and then also the stewardship of creation, both to be undertaken together and yet each in his or her own way, according to the genius of each. So this is really the story in both Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. In this sense, Christians can never be social contractarians. That is to say, their starting point cannot be individuals who somehow opt into social arrangements for mutual protection or prosperity. Even in a fallen world and among rebellious humanity, God has not withdrawn his providential grace, and to a greater and lesser extent, the essential structures of society, such as the family, arrangements for the defense and protection of citizens, provision for work, etc., reveal something of a divine purpose in the ordering of society. While Christians witness to the kingdom of God embodied in Jesus Christ and which is not of this world, they know also that the values of this kingdom have to be brought to bear on the kingdoms of this world so that they may approximate more and more to God's will for them until they become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ. Revelation 11:15. So Christian social witness and action is therefore rooted in both a Christian vision of the origin of society and of its goal. So you look backwards as well as forwards. At first, Israel was under God's direct rule through the leaders he chose to raise up. You can see some of them here: Moses, Joshua, and the judges. Under Saul and permanently under David and his descendants, I think you'll have to shift, Tom, yeah. That's quite a dark picture of Saul and David playing his harp. Under Saul and then under David and his descendants, the original theocracy was replaced by a limited monarchy, and by a separation of the spiritual from the temporal, of the priest and the temple from the palace and the king. So this is the burden of 1 Samuel 10, for instance, or Deuteronomy 17, the idea of a constitutional monarch, deeply rooted in the Bible, and the separation of the spiritual realm from the temple, from the temporal. The king and the court had specific responsibilities in governance, in maintaining law and order, preserving peace on the borders, and waging war when that became necessary. The Levitical priesthood, on the other hand, were in charge of the sacrificial system, the thank offerings, and the maintenance of the priesthood itself. Their separation of church from state, this separation of church from state is crucial for a biblical understanding of polity. It is true that in the course of history, it was not always observed, with priestly families sometimes being de facto rulers of Jerusalem and beyond, as in fact they were in the time of Jesus. In the Bible, however, the distinction is maintained, even though church and state are closely related and are expected to work together for the common good. For instance, the reforms under Josiah, as set out in 2 Kings 22 and 23, as also those of Ezra and Nehemiah. Jesus' cleansing of the temple may also, of course, be seen as a messianic and therefore royal act. This fundamental distinction between sacred and secular, and also their complementarity, is the background to Jesus' famous direction to render to Caesar what is rightfully Caesar's and to God what is rightfully God's. It is worth saying this because in many ancient religions, this distinction did not exist, as indeed it does not today in much Islamic polity. The default position in the Bible and Christian tradition is respect for and obedience to our rulers. They are an important aspect of the providential ordering of society to reward what is good and to punish what is evil. Romans 13, 1 Peter 2. There are limits, however, to such obedience. There are times, as Niebuhr has pointed out, when Christians must say no to cultural, political, or economic demands made on them by the dominant culture, even when it is the governing authorities which have sought to enforce such compliance. The early Christians who remained faithful went to their death or to torture and imprisonment for refusing to sacrifice to the gods and the Roman emperor, or in some cases simply for bearing the name Christian. In the Persian Empire, similarly, the Greek historian Sozomen records the terrible persecution of the church under Shapur II, but many other instances can also be given. In relation to Shapur II, I remember a couple of years ago, I was near Mosul, near the city of Dohuk in Iraq, northern Iraq, and there was a festival going on. And so I said, what is this festival? And it turned out that it was the Christians. They were celebrating the martyrs who had been put to death under Shapur II in the 4th century. So that martyrdom is still remembered among the Christian communities in Iraq today. The reasons usually were a refusal to worship the Shah and Shah, the Persian king of kings, and also the sun. So there are as many martyrs in the Persian Empire recorded in the various martyrologies as there were in the Roman Empire. This is not often known, but it should be better known. We must therefore say no to government when it coerces us to do something that God has forbidden, or conversely, when it forbids us to act in accordance with what God has revealed. This could be worship of the state's ideology, as in North Korea and even China, or unjust discrimination against people of a particular race, as in apartheid South Africa, in penal law arising from extremist interpretations of Sharia, or in matters of life and death. The nature of our sexual being and its expression, and what we teach our children in many so-called permissive societies. When and whether to say no is a matter for individual conscience, but it can also be led by the position adopted by a community of faith, or indeed by the wider community, acting in consonance with God's providential purposes. The courageous witness of the confessing church in Germany during the Nazi period is another example of a community of faith saying no to both the racist ideology and the absolute demands of the Nazi state. The Barmen Declaration, pictured here, which undergirded their communal life, and which was largely inspired by Karl Barth, rejected the idea of Deutsch Christen, or German Christians, as a racially defined group which owed ultimate allegiance to the German state. If the confessing church was the ecclesial expression of this resistance, surely the life, work, imprisonment, and manner of death of the great pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer was the personal. I think he's pictured in this group, actually, not only in his writings, but in his suffering and eventual execution. He showed the cost of saying no to tyranny. Every Christian and the whole church have a responsibility to say yes or no to the demands of culture, polity, or even family, clan, and tribe. Those who are called to a ministry of teaching and leading, such as bishops and clergy, have, however, a special role in voicing the teaching of the Bible and of the church in particular circumstances. In addition, the biblical witness is that God can call certain people to bear witness to his will in certain circumstances. There is a continuity between both testaments in the bearing of prophetic witness and in the exercise of the prophetic office. In the Hebrew Bible, the prophet receives God's word through vision, dream, or the direct inspiration of the Spirit of God. This word is given so that it may be communicated to the people of God, those in authority, and even the nations round about. The word is a forthtelling in speech or action of God's will in a particular situation. This is not arbitrary or fickle, but it is always related to who God is, how he has made the world, and what are his expectations of humans in the choices facing them. The prophetical office is also about foretelling, that is, warning or promising what the future will look like, depending on whether we choose to ignore or obey God's words to us. Once again, this is not magic or clairvoyance, but insight about the future in the light of the Word of God. Old Testament prophecy continues in the New in the person of John the Baptist or of Simeon or Anna, but there is also the distinctive exercise of prophecy and the office of prophet in the new order. So prophets begin to be mentioned very early on in the Acts of the Apostles. They have particular responsibilities of forthtelling and foretelling, and the office of prophet is described in a number of the Pauline letters. There is no reason, of course, to believe that such a ministry is not needed any longer in the church. It is true that the closure of the biblical canon means that the teaching of the church and of its ministers must always be in agreement with it. But the very existence of a proclaiming and teaching ministry demands that the scriptures and their teaching should be related to the varying circumstances and challenges of each age and each culture. It would appear that the office of bishop developed not only from the need for the presbyters or elders of the local church to have a chairman, but also from that of the apostolic delegates, Timothy and Titus, who had oversight of the churches of Ephesus and Crete respectively, and responsibility for appointing presbyters, deacons, and other office holders. Timothy is explicitly told to preach the word and to be urgent in season and out of season, fulfilling the work of an evangelist. Clearly, there was fluidity in the early period of forms of ministry and the organization of local churches, but it was never just charismatic communities at first and then a gradual institutionalization. From the beginning, it seems the apostle provided some kind of order for the churches founded as a result of their mission. Act 6, the appointment of the 7, 13, the sending out of Paul and Barnabas themselves then appointing presbyters or elders, and so on. Not only that, but the principle of episcopae or of oversight is expressed in one way or another and is embedded in the New Testament's ecclesiology. Bishop Charles Gore, in his work on the Christian ministry, points out that both in the New Testament and in sub-apostolic literature, we find a ministry of apostles and prophets, which is different from that of the presbyter bishops. The term presbyter and bishop are used interchangeably, and the deacons, and is supervisory of them, so that the apostles and prophets supervise the localized ministries of presbyter, bishops, and deacons. In the very early didache, or the teaching of the 12 apostles, contemporary possibly with the New Testament documents themselves, the prophets, who are also called apostles, are allowed to say the Eucharistic prayer extempore. If they settle down in a community, they are to be supported with the first fruits of the community, for whom they are called the high priests. Such a localization of a hitherto itinerant ministry of encouragement and teaching, according to Gore, has also contributed to the emergence of the historic episcopate. Thus, the bishop is not just a fellow presbyter, but is an apostolic delegate and has a prophetic mission and ministry. It's worth for bishops and the rest of the church to remember this. J.B. Lightfoot also gives us a view of how the episcopate has emerged, as does Richard Hooker, who also emphasizes that there are certain particular things that pertain to the office of the bishop. Presbyters share, of course, in the whole of the bishop's ministry, and that must include the prophetic and missionary aspects of it. In 1 Timothy 5:17, we are told that those stipendiary clergy who preach and teach are worthy of a double reward. It's a monetary point that is being made there. Such preaching and teaching would surely have included ministries both of foretelling and forthtelling. One of the Gospels said for the ordination of priests in the ordinal attached to the Book of Common Prayer is from St. Matthew chapter 9, where Jesus asks the disciples to pray that God will provide laborers for the harvest that is ready. The ordaining bishop then tells those about to be ordained priests that they are to be messengers as well as stewards and watchmen. It is true that the Anglican tradition has tended to emphasize the pastoral role of clergy, and this has been enormously beneficial for the congregations where they have worked. But newer ordinals are bringing back a sense of mission to the work of presbyters. The Common Worship Ordinal of the Church of England tells us, for instance, that presbyters are to proclaim the gospel and to resist evil, support the weak, defend the poor, and intercede for all those in need. There is clearly a prophetic ministry here. If Acts chapter 6 is to be seen, as Anglican tradition has always done, as a prototype of the appointment of deacons, then it is clear that the meeting of material need was one of their prime responsibilities. As the case of the first martyr Stephen shows, this by no means excluded a vigorous defense of the gospel and a prophetic ministry to the leaders of his own people. Nor did it exclude Philip, another of the 7, from exercising an evangelistic ministry on the very borders of the faith. Acts 8, 5-40. The Book of Common Prayer Ordinal has the bishop telling the ordinand that among the tasks of a deacon is to search for the sick, the poor, and impotent people of the parish, so that they are relieved of their needs. In newer books of common prayer, this is strengthened to include not only the proclamation of the gospel in word and deed, but to search out for the sick and the lonely, the oppressed and the powerless. Once again, there is clearly a ministry to the marginalized in mind here, and from time to time, this must include ministries of encouragement and prophetic engagement. Many church traditions have established and have developing bodies of social teaching, which attempt to provide a common mind, or at least a common starting point for thinking about the vital social, economic, and political issues of the day. The Roman Catholic Church's long tradition in this area, which stretches back to the debates about the fundamental rights of the indigenous people of the Americas, held between the Dominicans and the so-called humanists in the 16th century, and back to St. Thomas Aquinas himself, is well summed up in the Second Vatican Council's Gaudium et Spes, the Church in the Modern World. Anglicanism also has a long history of social concern. From the beginnings of Anglican reform, poor laws were framed on a national scale, in contrast, for instance, to provision that was made on the basis of local communities in continental Europe. Here, it was the poor laws since Henry VIII have been on a national level, but with the parish as the focus and agent of delivery for poor relief. Mutatis mutandis, these continued in place until the 19th century when they were replaced by the workhouse law. In the 1547 injunctions of the boy King Edward VI, who reigned from 1547 to 1553, congregations were ordered to install what the Book of Common Prayer came to call the poor men's box near the high altar, so that what parishioners had previously spent on pardons, pilgrimages, trentals, decking of images, offering of candles, giving to friars, and upon other like blind devotions, I quote, they could now give to help the poor and needy, knowing that to relieve the poor is a true worshipping of God, and that also whatsoever is given for their comfort is given to Christ himself, and so is accepted of him. 2 centuries later, the evangelical movement similarly had an outstanding commitment to social issues, working for the amelioration of the conditions in which the poor lived and worked, for the abolition of slavery and the evil trade which went with it, and for universal education. Such involvement went hand in hand with a post-millennial view of Christ's return, holding that the proclamation of the gospel would usher in an age of prosperity and then Christ would return. It was incumbent upon believers, therefore, to work for such an age in preparation for his return. During the course of the 19th century, this belief was replaced by premillennialism, which declared that Christ would return first and then usher in his kingdom of love, justice, and peace. This, along with a rejection of liberal Protestantism's facile optimism regarding human progress, led to the evangelical withdrawal from the social and political scene. It was only at the Lausanne Congress of 1974, pictured here, that evangelicals once again were able to affirm their commitment to socio-political involvement and responsibility, even if the extent and form of it was debatable and debated. The follow-up to Lausanne at Grand Rapids, Michigan, reaffirmed Lausanne in declaring that evangelism and social responsibility, while distinct, were integrally related to the proclamation of the whole gospel. They were like two blades of a pair of scissors. Questions remained, however, as to whether this was just about social service or included action to challenge injustice, discrimination, and exploitation. There was disagreement also about the role of churches in anything that went beyond service, or whether that should be left to the well-formed consciences of individual believers. Since the beginning of the Lambeth Conferences in 1867, that's the first one, the Anglican Communion has also developed social teaching in a number of areas. The preparatory documents, reports, and resolutions of the conferences reveal a concern for a wide range of issues ranging from discrimination and torture to disarmament and ecology. There's been teaching on the family, on contraception, and on human sexuality. Conferences have given attention to matters of human development and to economic systems, to drug and alcohol abuse, to gambling, and to trafficking. One feature of much church teaching in the area of social responsibility has been the use of the method of developing a common mind on the critical issues of the day and disseminating such a consensus among the members of the churches and beyond that. The method developed in the early part of the last century by the emerging ecumenical movement among the churches, especially in the life and work movement, and Archbishop William Temple's Conference on Christian Politics, Economics, and Citizenship in Birmingham in 1924, concentrated on building a common mind among people from diverse Christian traditions. Temple's way was to develop middle axioms, which stood between fundamental theological convictions and action in parliament, floor, or street. So if we believed in the inalienable dignity of the human person as a basic theological belief, a middle axiom might be that therefore citizens in a particular nation state should have provided for them the basic necessities of life. This would then lead to practical action on the floor of parliament or the shop or the factory or the street. In the United Kingdom, this approach was hugely successful in the creation of a consensus which led to the creation and the sustaining of the welfare state. The very phrase welfare state we may owe to Archbishop Temple. From the 1960s, however, many Christians in Africa, Asia, and Latin America began to criticize this approach as tilted towards those already with power, seeking to modify their thinking and hoping thereby to ameliorate the lot of the poor and the powerless. What people wanted now was to organize for direct action in changing the situation of the poor rather than waiting for the minds of the powerful to be changed. The focus of much of this agitation was the continued survival of apartheid in South Africa, which legally and socially discriminated against the Black and other non-white groups in the country, while privileging the whites in every area of life. Rampant inequality in South America, the paucity of clergy in the Roman Catholic Church there, along with a desire among lay people to be authentically church themselves, all led to the emergence of the basic communities. So the basic Christian communities, the BCCs, organized for worship, supported their members in their needs, and prepared to be advocates for them in public life. In parts of Asia also, rapid urbanization had led to the emergence of an underclass whose cries of suffering were seldom heard by Christian leaders trying to interact with the wealthy and the powerful. Church organizations like the World Council of Churches began to make direct grants, for example, to liberation movements in Southern Africa. Liberation theology became the rage in both Western and non-Western theological circles. It is true that many of the liberation movements supported by the WCC, for example, in Southern Africa, have become the governments in the countries of the region. At the same time, some have themselves become corrupt and totalitarian. Classic cases of the oppressed becoming the oppressors. David Martin, Rebecca Shaw, and other social scientists have shown that in Latin America and to some extent in India also, Pentecostals and evangelicals are bringing about social change, even if their emphasis is on personal conversion and discipleship, in ways that the basic Christian communities were not able to do because they did not give enough attention to people's spiritual motivation. So David Martin, who is himself an Anglican layman, says that what is happening with the explosion of Pentecostalism in Latin America is that the man gets converted, becomes a Christian. So he stops drinking. Because he stops drinking, he stops abusing his wife. Because both parents are now at home, the children do their homework, so they do better at school. Because they're honest, their employers trust them and they do well at work. And so there's a kind of virtuous cycle that is created, which starts with the emphasis on the individual rather than on society, but it has huge social implications. I mean, that is the point that Martin is making. After Lausanne and its follow-up, a number of evangelical groups in different parts of the world have begun to take up the agenda of an integral proclamation of the gospel, which included evangelism and church planting, social service, and when necessary, challenging the powers that be on questions of fundamental freedoms, equal citizenship for all, democracy, and corruption. They have rejected the Western bifurcation of evangelism and social concern and are building churches and institutions which embody such a holistic approach. So when I was with the CMS, I was also at the same time one of the board of directors of Christian Aid. And I also always regretted this division between social action, Christian aid, and Christian mission. It seemed always to me and seems today that they belong together. And I think some of the African churches in particular have shown us a way of how to keep these different elements together with integrity, so that the provision, for instance, for material needs is not a vehicle simply for proselytization, but it is a moment of witness, of Christian witness, just as dialogue is not just about converting our partner, it is also listening to them and trying to be in their shoes, but it must also at the same time be an opportunity for authentic Christian witness, just as we are prepared to hear what our partner has to say. Now, I think this holistic approach that has been taken in Africa and some other parts of the world has given the church a credibility which is beyond its numbers and resources, not only with local people, but often with those involved in public life, who cannot afford to ignore the significant change that is taking place on their doorstep. So in a world of growing hostility to the Christian faith, whether that arises from religious ideology, chauvinistic nationalism, or as in the West with liberal intolerance, the prophetic witness of the church and of Christians will be more and more needed. It is part of the task of mission formation in our churches today to equip clergy and lay people not to shrink from such witness when it is required, even if the result can be exclusion and persecution. So that is what I had to say about prophetic ministry, social responsibility, and action. This leaves the whole question about the nature of evangelization, of course. What part does evangelization play in this vision of the wholeness of Christian mission? Does it have any part? And that is something that we will address the next time if God gives us the opportunity. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Bishop Michael. And again, a reminder to everyone, if you wish to raise a question or have a comment on Bishop Michael's talk, do use the reaction button at the bottom of your screen and then raise your hand, and I will call on you and you can unmute. Thank you, Bishop Michael. There's, I guess, one of the things that even as you're going through your talk, especially in terms of the church and the statements it has developed over the years with ecumenical councils or synods or Lambeth, all required a community that came together to speak with one voice to those in power and to put forward statements and that kind of thing to wider society. My question is that though in the last 20, 30 years, especially evangelicals, of which I count myself one, we tend to be so fractious that we end up a million shards. So we don't, even when I was working in Singapore, I was part of the National Council of Churches Singapore. One frustrated MP said, you Protestants are like mosquitoes. I never know which one to grab and talk to. How do you see this developing? And do you see this fracturing of the councils healable, or are we going to end up with a whole host of different groups that are atomizing? And I think especially in the Anglican Communion, because as you know, there are many who boycotted the last Lambeth. So there's a lot of issues there, but what do you think the future holds in that regard in terms of the church speaking as a unit to a wider society?
Yes, I think Marina mentioned last time, I don't know if she's here today, but last time she mentioned the landmark agreement between the WCC, the Vatican, and the World Evangelical Alliance on the nature of mission. So it was limited, but nevertheless it was real. And I think that is very important, that the whole church should agree about the crucial issues of the day, and even within denominations, for one part of the church not to go off and do something without consulting the others. I mean, this is what causes the trouble and the disunity that you're talking about. So the ancient canonical principle is that what touches everyone must be decided by everyone. And that's true of inculturation, as we were thinking about last time, that of course you must relate to your culture and society in the way that is most appropriate for you, but you must always be aware that if this touches your brother and sister somewhere else, then you've got to consult with them. I think consultation, I mean, Lausanne set out a good way of people consulting, from very different constituencies, Pentecostal, evangelical, mainline, etc., and to come to some agreement. I think the agreement about the relationship of social concern and social activism to evangelism was quite a departure, and has affected many people in constructing their own ministries and developing their own ministries.
Good. Well, please raise your hands and ask questions of Bishop Michael. Good. Amir, please unmute and ask your question.
Yes. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I truly enjoyed it, and it was very insightful. I just have a question. As you were discussing the last question, that's basically one of the challenges that I have been thinking about in the past couple of weeks. Is the balance between control and decentralization. As you were saying that when we're talking about enculturation or other issues, so then if it is if it is a matter that is influencing everyone, it should be decided by everyone. Well, I fully understand that, but how for an Asian church, that everything is decentralized, everything is based on diversity, multiplicity, and I mean, very different centers. How can we reconcile that control with that multiplicity? And from your wisdom, I mean, of course, you have a lot more experience and wisdom than I have. How do you balance that in your theology or in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, you can't prescribe for it in advance, but take this question about what forms of worship to use. Now, clearly, any church in a particular cultural situation will use what is around them to help in the worship. So music is an obvious example, where the stronger the tradition of indigenous music, the better it is for the spirituality of people. But also in posture, in dress, in color, and all of these things, people do and should use their own cultural situation. But if they start doing something that other Christians have not done and think that it compromises the gospel, for instance, if they, I mean, to take in a Muslim context, if they started to worship in a way that seemed to Muslims, for instance, like the Salat, that would be going too far. And I think the church would tell them that. I mean, people have tried this, this is not a theoretical point. They have tried this. So similarly, if Christians in India, for instance, were contextualizing to the point where Christian worship looked like idol worship, that would be going too far. Marriage is another, weddings are another example. Of course, we must contextualize. I remember teaching some people who had come to Christian faith from a Hindu background in a Muslim context, but they were their community was Hindu, and the Hindu marriage, as you know, the wedding, one of its important parts is going around the fire. So what should the Christians do now? Is going around the fire too much of a compromise or not? So the decision they came to, and we didn't prescribe it for them, but they came to the decision that they would not go around the fire, but they would go around the cross. So that was the right, that was the limit of contextualization for them. It has to be recognizable. I mean, whatever we do has to be recognizable to the universal church. Just as what other people are doing, we need to be able to recognize.
TV, go ahead.
Bishop Michael, I do agree with you that Lausanne 74 with the Lausanne Covenant was a major breakthrough in bringing the understanding of social concern and proclamation evangelism together. My over the last years, my question has been, how much does these big conclaves, the decisions made on these big conclaves, finally filter to the local church? What I sense, it does not often reach to the local church. So as much as some of us may quote Lausanne Covenant or whatever other gatherings where we have made declarations, it doesn't seem to get to the local church as I travel around the world that I've observed. So the question is, how can the local church leaders be prophetic to their local community when there's been wonderful conceptualized declarations that exists?
Yeah, I am a great believer in smaller consultations. I think it is very important for people to meet. Whether they meet in huge gatherings, I mean, I don't know. I don't like them very much myself, though I've been to some of them. But it is important for people to meet, to learn from each other, to be inspired by one another, to criticize one another, and all of those things. I think Lausanne has not changed everything, but it has changed some things. It is, for instance, it is now possible to refer to Lausanne to justify to Christian leaders certain things that you may be doing, which in the past would not have been acceptable. So it does carry that kind of credibility. This agreement between the World Council of Churches, WEA, and the Vatican shows people that it is possible for a wide cross-section of the Christian world to agree on something. I mean, that itself is quite remarkable, isn't it? So yeah, I mean, these things are limited, but the process of awareness raising, the process of learning and teaching has to go on in all sorts of ways. My fear with many pastors certainly is that they stop learning theological college. The attitude is, well, I've done that now, and but ministry is about continued learning, and from people who may be quite unlike ourselves in their situation.
Good. Fernando, I saw a hand go up. Do you have a question?
Yes. Sorry. I think in this prophetic approach also is considered the systemic aspects, of society. One could be the economic systems.
Yeah.
I think that still there is a tension between liberalism and socialism. I think that the approach of Scripture in New Testament is more of a solidarity type, this image of the body, well, many other aspects. I think that this aspect is not so emphasized in general in all the traditions. And what do you think, especially? I want to comment, for instance, in BAM movement, business as mission, that is within the Lausanne movement.
Yeah.
I think that they have embraced liberalism. I don't see this acknowledgement of the good contributions of the socialist tradition, connected with the matter of justice, and I think that this is a tension in the world still, and everywhere. In America, for instance, you see the Democratic Party. There is a branch that emphasizes more, for instance, Bernie Sanders, and they are blamed as people so radical. Well, what do you think about the acknowledgement of this tradition within the Christian church, and emphasizing and not rejecting totally? I am very sad about the BAM movement, that this is it's not that. For instance, there are many currents about not necessarily socialist, but more it's called social solidarity economics, and there are many productions in an open society, no? But I don't see within the Christian representing this emphasis of the economics global system. Sorry, that this is my.
No, I think this is very important. I mean, where socialism is concerned, there are two quite different streams of it. So there is the kind of doctrinaire Marxism, and there are certain elements of Marxist social analysis that deserve our attention. For instance, the Marx's insight that after the Industrial Revolution, the worker became more and more alienated from the product of his work. So that, what he produced didn't belong to him, it belonged to somebody else. I think Christians should think about that. But the other stream of socialism, of course, came basically from a Christian nonconformist cradle. I mean, here in Great Britain, for instance, the Labour Party was born out of nonconformist and sort of Methodist social concern, that kind of. So it had an explicitly Christian basis. Also, as I was saying, the idea of the welfare state, that there should be no one in a society without the basic necessities of life, came from the kind of thinking that Archbishop Temple and the life and work movement of the WCC, or what later became the WCC, were doing. I mean, obviously business, if you're going to produce wealth, you have to have economic activity. And it has been shown beyond doubt, I think, that economic activity is best carried out if people have an incentive to improve themselves, to improve their families, and so on. But it cannot be just neoliberalism of the kind that I think you have in mind. It has to be modified, for instance, by the taxation system, the fiscal arrangements. It has to be modified by the workers' right to organize themselves. So trades unions have themselves become sometimes instruments of oppression, but the idea of trades unions is a good one for labor to be able to organize itself to get its basic necessities. It can also, a Christian vision should, I think, encourage the participation of workers in an enterprise. And there are some good examples. The John Lewis stores are a good example where workers actually are also the owners of the enterprise. So they have a stake. And it also overcomes Marx's objection about alienation. So everything that is being produced is being also owned by everybody. I think that kind of thing has to be promoted more, so that people do have a stake in their work and in what they produce. On the global front, the danger is, first of all, of mega systems, whether it is the socialist system of China or the neoliberal system of the United States, not leaving any room for any other model. That's the first thing. The other, of course, is hegemony. So Africa, I think, will become the battlefield now between the US model and the Chinese model for the foreseeable future. And this will not be very good for Africans themselves, I expect, I'm sure. So from the point of view of a biblical critique, we cannot endorse any system. We have to look at what the system is actually doing and to support where it is promoting justice and a fair distribution of resources, and to criticize it where it is not.
Sam, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Bishop, again for stimulating conversation and just reflection and prodding us to think through some of these issues. My question is in regard to race and theological and what is the prophetic, especially in light of recent race, tension in the U.S. And Black church has been largely segregated. Sunday morning is still the most segregated hour of the week. And how do we, from a biblical theological perspective, we have the history of colonialism and slavery at the wake of the recent, growing disparity between various races and elitism of certain parties, certain groups of people, certain racial sectors. What is the role of the church? Racial reconciliation is a paradigm that has not got us any further than, of course, it has prodded the conversation. What does racial justice look like? There's a lot of hue and cry. Black Lives Matter, justice and dignity for the Black people who have fallen through the cracks of American capitalism and democracy. And what is the role of the church in understanding theological underpinnings of a racialized society and being a voice for justice and equity and camaraderie and together in the mission of God across racial lines? What does it take, European or American or Western Anglican or evangelical community to post-racial society, post-racial church? How does it look like, and how do we need to be engaged as people of God in the work of God in the world?
Yeah, I mean, the Bible, of course, this may be an exaggeration, but I think the Bible really teaches there is only one race, the human race, and the idea of common origin. See, the whole idea of the equality of persons, that doesn't mean every kind of equality of behavior or lifestyle, but the equality of persons is rooted in the biblical idea of common origin. I'm old enough to know that even in the 60s and 70s, scientists were talking about the possibility of human races having different origins. But that has been now put paid to by genetics, which also affirm the biblical insight of common origin. So I think that is very important, common origin. I sometimes tell the story of CMS missionaries in Australia in the 19th century, going around preaching in the settler towns. And from time to time, we hear of them being run out of those towns. Why were they being run out? They were being run out because they were quoting from Acts 17, Paul's speech at Athens, where he says, out of one blood hath he made all the nations of men, in the old translation. And the settlers were just not willing to believe that they were of the same blood as the Aboriginals. So, that kind of witness remains necessary for us today, of course, in all sorts of circumstances. It's not just against white or black or white or brown or white or yellow. There is racial prejudice amongst people of all kinds. The Indian caste system is built on that. The very word for caste in Sanskrit, varna, means color. Bernard Lewis wrote a very fine book on race in Islam and the status of people who were enslaved and so on. So it's not peculiar to any culture, and all of us have to be aware of this. The United States situation is a particularly difficult one because of the question of slavery. I mean, and yeah, I mean, it is clear to a visitor that justice has not yet been done for those who were enslaved for so many centuries, and that the result, not only the economic, but the social results of slavery are still there to be seen. And not only has justice not been done, but it is still not being done. I mean, that's the, so I'm absolutely appalled at the way the police behave in the United States with all kinds of people, but particularly African Americans. That does not justify making the issue an ideological one that then leads itself to violence and things like that, which of course has been the case, that genuine protests have been taken by ideological movements for their own ends. And it is not just race, there are other areas where that is also happening. One of the things that the early church did was to speak of Christians as the third race. So there were in ancient classical terms, there were the Greeks and the barbarians. So who were the Christians? So they were a third race. They were neither the one thing nor the other. And to present ourselves as the beginning of a new creation, or something that God has begun again. It's the rerunning, or the running again, as it were, of the story of humanity. A new start, if you like. I think that is what the early Christians meant by third race. I was saying during our discussions on inculturation that I used to be very hostile to the homogeneous unit principle. But I've come to see that there is a limited use for it. I think there are, people who are like each other do need to come together, even in a Christian context. I mean, language is a clear example of why people need to come together, but it might be musical tradition or a way of worship or whatever. As long as they are also willing and able and do come together with people who are unlike themselves. I think that's the point. You can't just say, as I've seen on numerous occasions in numerous situations, people restricting Christian worship, participation in Christian worship with people who are like themselves. That is not wrong, but it is not enough. So there has to be something more than that. And the segregation in the churches in the US that you spoke of, I mean, that is simply not good enough. That ways have to be found for people to be worshiping together as well as apart, if that is still required. That is happening in some cases in the US, and some of the events that you were mentioning have actually triggered this. So there may be something good that comes out of them. But when churches speak on race, they must make it clear that their point of departure is the Bible's teaching of common origin.
Good. Do we have any other questions, or will we put a bow on this? Well, Michael, thank you very much for a stimulating lecture. We look forward to the conclusions, 2 sessions in May, and hope to see many of you next week when we have our next Montague Barker lecture series. So with that, I will bid adieu and blessings to you all.
Thank you.